Welcome, friend. Pull your blanket closer and let the warmth surround you. Tonight, we journey back 700 years to a time when winter wasn't just cold. It was a test of survival itself, a season that could decide the fate of entire families, entire villages, with a single harsh storm or failed harvest. Before electric heaters warmed our homes, before supermarkets lined their shelves with food from around the world, before weather forecasts warned us of approaching storms, there lived people who faced the darkness of winter with nothing but their wits, their community, and ancient wisdom passed down through countless generations of survivors. These weren't the lords and ladies of grand castles, whose stories fill our history books. These were ordinary people, farmers and crafters, mothers and fathers, children and elders, who developed ingenious ways to not just survive, but to find warmth, comfort, and even joy in the heart of winter's cold embrace. Close your eyes if you wish, and let me take you to a medieval village. As the first frost touches the ground and families begin their ancient dance of preparation. For months of cold that could mean the difference between life and death, between thriving and merely surviving, between hope and despair. You'll hear the whispered secrets that kept families warm when the world turned frozen and hostile, the forgotten knowledge of how our ancestors transformed scarcity into abundance through cleverness and cooperation, the stories of how they built communities so strong that winter became not an enemy to fear, but a teacher to learn from. Let yourself drift as we explore together the ingenious ways medieval people turned winter from a season of death into a time of deepening bonds, creative solutions, and profound understanding of what truly matters when survival hangs in the balance. Listen closely, for in these ancient strategies lie timeless truths about resilience, about finding light in darkness, about creating warmth not just for the body, but for the spirit, that remain as relevant today as they were 7 centuries ago. In medieval times, winter wasn't simply another season in the cycle of the year, it was a siege. A months-long battle against cold and hunger and death that required the same careful planning and strategic thinking that generals brought to warfare. Starting in late summer, when the first leaves began to hint at gold, entire villages would begin their battle preparations, transforming from communities of farmers and craftspeople into armies of survival. Every decision made in autumn, every choice about what to harvest and what to preserve, what to repair and what to stockpile, could determine who would see the green shoots of spring and who would rest forever beneath the winter earth. Listen carefully. Can you hear them across the centuries? The rhythmic thwack of scythes cutting grain in the early morning light, the gentle rustle of wheat being bundled with rough twine, the soft thud of apples falling into wicker baskets, the creak of wooden carts carrying the harvest home. These weren't just the sounds of farming. They were the sounds of preparation for war. Medieval farmers knew something we've forgotten in our world of global supply chains and climate-controlled stores. That winter begins its planning not in November, when the first snow falls, but in July, when the grain stands tall and golden in the fields. They understood that every day of warmth was a gift to be used wisely. Every hour of sunlight, an opportunity that might not come again for months. The wise village elder, her face weathered by decades of reading sky and wind and cloud, would watch the heavens with eyes that had seen 40 winters or more, feeling the air with hands that could detect the subtlest changes in pressure and humidity. "The ash trees are heavy with berries this year," she might whisper to the younger women as they worked. "Winter will be harsh and long. We must gather more than we think we need. For need has a way of growing when the snow grows deep." They read nature like a book we can no longer decipher, understanding that every creature, every plant, every element of the natural world was constantly sending signals about what lay ahead. Thick fur on rabbits in September meant that brutal cold was coming, fur so thick that nature itself was preparing for temperatures that could kill. Early migration of birds warned of storms that would arrive sooner and stay longer than usual. Even the bark of trees grew thicker in years when harsh winters approached, as if the forest itself was donning extra layers for the trials ahead. The behavior of insects told stories too. Ants building their hills higher than usual, spiders spinning webs in unusual places, beetles burrowing deeper than normal. All signs that those who live closest to the earth were preparing for something severe. The thickness of onion skins, the density of corn husks, the way cats groomed themselves more frequently and thoroughly, all were part of nature's early warning system that medieval people had learned to read with the precision of scientists. Old Willem, the village's most experienced farmer, a man whose grandfather had taught him secrets learned from his grandfather before him, could predict winter's severity by watching how deep the earthworms burrowed into the soil. "When they go down 3 hand spans deep," he would tell his son while they worked together in the fields, "we'll need 4 months of stored grain instead of 3, and we'll need twice as much firewood as we think, for the earth itself is telling us that the cold will reach deeper than usual this year." But preparation went far beyond simply gathering food and fuel. Picture young Thomas, barely 16 but already bearing the responsibilities of a man, helping his father stuff every tiny crack and crevice in their cottage walls with a carefully prepared mixture of mud and straw and animal dung, pressing this primitive but effective insulation into gaps so small you could barely see them, yet gaps that could spell the difference between warmth and freezing on the coldest nights. "Every tiny hole," his father would say, breath already visible in the cooling autumn air, "every crack no wider than a blade of grass, is a door for death to enter our home. Winter is patient and clever. It will find every weakness, exploit every flaw, so we must be more patient and more clever still." The process was methodical, almost ritualistic, starting at the foundation and working systematically up each wall, each gap sealed not just with mud, but with the accumulated wisdom of generations who had learned these lessons through bitter experience. Thomas learned to feel for the slightest draft with hands that grew more sensitive each day, to identify where the winter wind might find entry through techniques passed down from father to son for centuries. His fingers became so attuned to air movement that he could detect currents that would have been imperceptible to most people, reading the walls of their home like a sailor reads the wind, understanding that the difference between a warm house and a cold grave often lay in such tiny details. The women of the village gathered what they called winter's ammunition, resources that would prove as vital as any weapon in the coming battle for survival. Dried moss for kindling, collected carefully from the north sides of oak trees where it grew thickest and most resistant to flame. Gathered only on dry days when it contained the least moisture, sorted by quality and stored in containers that would keep it bone dry through the wettest months. Resin from pine trees for waterproofing, scraped with wooden tools in long strips and stored in clay pots sealed with beeswax. This golden, sticky substance would seal boots and cloaks, patch holes in containers, and even serve as emergency medicine when mixed with other herbs. Each drop was precious, each jar a small fortune in the economics of survival. Even animal fat was treasured, saved not just for cooking, but for rubbing on hands and faces and feet, creating a protective barrier against wind that could freeze exposed flesh in mere minutes. The fat was rendered slowly over low fires, purified and stored in small containers, rationed like gold throughout the long months when every calorie could mean the difference between strength and weakness. Marie, the village's most skilled gatherer, a woman whose knowledge of plants and seasons was legendary throughout the region, knew exactly when each resource was at its peak, when moss held its fire-starting properties longest, when pine resin was clearest and most potent, when roots contained the most nutrition and herbs retained the greatest healing power. She taught the younger women these secrets with the solemnity of a priest passing on sacred mysteries. For in truth, that's exactly what they were. Moss collected in September after 3 days without rain held its fire-starting properties through the entire winter, while moss gathered at other times might fail when you needed it most. Pine resin gathered after the first light frost was clearest and strongest, containing fewer impurities and more of the compounds that made it invaluable for waterproofing. She shared this knowledge freely, understanding that the survival of the community depended on everyone knowing these crucial details. And then there were the hidden preparations, the ones spoken of only in hushed tones when children were asleep and neighbors were distant. Secret stores of grain buried in earthen pots beneath cottage floors, containers lined with charcoal to absorb moisture and sealed with layers of beeswax to keep dampness out, extra bundles of dried herbs tucked into the thatch of roofs where casual thieves wouldn't think to look. Hidden caches of preserved food scattered in multiple locations so that no single disaster could claim everything. Because medieval people knew, from hard experience learned through famines and failed harvests, that sometimes survival meant keeping secrets, even from your neighbors. Not out of selfishness or greed, but out of the harsh necessity imposed by scarcity. If word spread that one family had more than others, if desperation and hunger drove people beyond the bounds of normal behavior, friends could become enemies. When children were starving, and the last store of grain could mean the difference between life and death. Each family developed their own systems, their own coded ways of remembering where precious supplies were hidden. Locations known only to parents, and passed carefully to children, as they proved trustworthy and mature enough to understand the terrible responsibility. It was a delicate balance, having enough hidden away to survive the worst possibilities, while still maintaining the community cooperation and mutual aid that made survival possible for the village as a whole. Children were taught these secrets gradually, layer by layer, as they demonstrated not just trustworthiness, but wisdom. The understanding that survival often depended on the ability to keep silent even under pressure, even when friends asked uncomfortable questions, even when hunger made sharing seem like the moral choice. They learned that sometimes the most loving thing you could do for your community was to ensure your own family's survival, for dead families helped no one. The psychological preparation was just as important as the physical stockpiling. Parents would tell children carefully chosen stories of previous harsh winters, not to frighten them into despair, but to build the mental resilience that would carry them through months of hardship. These weren't casual bedtime stories, but deliberate exercises in building courage and hope. Your grandfather survived the winter of 7 moons, a mother might say to her children as they helped with the harvest. When snow fell for 40 days straight, and the drifts grew so high that houses disappeared entirely. When food ran so low that people ate bark soup and considered themselves fortunate. When the cold was so severe that even the wine froze solid in its barrels. If he could endure that and still smile in the spring, if he could find reasons to laugh even in the darkest days, then we can endure whatever winter brings us this year. These stories served multiple purposes beyond simple encouragement. They gave children heroes to emulate, living proof that survival was possible even under the most extreme circumstances. They also contained practical information disguised as entertainment, techniques for finding food, methods for staying warm, signs that indicated when the worst had passed and spring was truly coming. A tale about how great-uncle Johann found fresh water when all the wells had frozen, contained step-by-step instructions for locating springs under ice and snow. A story about Aunt Greta's famous stew that could feed a dozen people from ingredients that seemed barely enough for 2, taught the crucial art of making meager supplies stretch through creative cooking and careful rationing. By October's end, when the last golden leaf had fallen from the trees, and the final apple had been carefully stored in the root cellar, when every tool had been sharpened and every tear in clothing had been mended. The village would grow quiet with a stillness that was not the silence of death, but the hush of preparation complete. Every family knew exactly how much food they had, down to the last handful of grain and the final preserved apple. How much wood was stacked and ready for burning. How many warm clothes were mended and waiting. How much oil remained for lamps, and how many candles could be spared for the darkest nights. They had calculated and recalculated, planned and replanned, until they knew their resources as intimately as they knew their own heartbeats. The siege was about to begin, but they were as ready as human ingenuity and ancient wisdom could make them. Ready for the battle that would test not just their bodies, but their spirits, their communities, but their souls. Ready to prove once again that humans could survive and even thrive in conditions that seemed designed to destroy them. Now let me tell you about medieval genius, hidden in plain sight, disguised as humble simplicity, but containing wisdom that modern engineering is only beginning to rediscover. Those simple cottages scattered across the medieval landscape, with their thick walls and small windows, their thatched roofs and earthen floors, that looked so primitive to modern eyes, were actually marvels of survival engineering, designed and refined by people who understood cold and heat and airflow in ways we are only now beginning to appreciate. Built by those who knew that a poorly designed house wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deadly. The hearth wasn't just a fireplace where flames danced for warmth and light. It was the beating heart of the entire home, the central organ around which all life revolved. Built from carefully selected local stone that had been tested over generations for its ability to absorb heat during the day and radiate that stored warmth slowly through the long cold nights. Positioned with mathematical precision to maximize heating efficiency throughout the entire dwelling. Picture Emma, a village woman whose grandmother had taught her the ancient arts of hearth tending, preparing her family's fire for the long winter ahead. She would line the firebed with special clay. Not just any clay, but specific types gathered from particular riverbanks, chosen for their iron content and heat retention properties that had been proven over centuries of use. This clay came from deposits formed over thousands of years, clay that contained just the right minerals to hold heat for hours after flames died down, to distribute that heat evenly rather than in sharp bursts, to create thermal mass that could warm a room long after the last ember had faded. The knowledge of where to find the best clay, which banks produced the most effective varieties, which seasons provided optimal gathering conditions, was passed down through generations of women like a sacred trust. "The fire must never truly die," she whispers to her daughter as they work together, their hands dark with clay and ash. "We feed it like a living thing, tend it like a beloved animal, and it keeps us alive in return. The fire is not our servant, but our partner. Respect it, and it will protect you. Neglect it, and it will abandon you when you need it most." This wasn't superstition, but practical wisdom born from understanding that a family's survival depended entirely on their relationship with flame. The chimney design, so simple it seemed primitive, was actually a marvel of fluid dynamics, created without formal education, but with intuitive understanding of how air moves and heat travels. The chimney created a draft that pulled smoke up and out, while drawing fresh air in through carefully placed gaps, maintaining air quality while maximizing heat retention, preventing the buildup of dangerous gases, while ensuring that precious warmth didn't escape unnecessarily. But the real secrets of medieval thermal engineering were in the details that casual observers never noticed. Medieval builders understood thermal mass centuries before the term existed. They built thick walls that absorbed heat during the day when fires burned bright and released that stored energy slowly through the night when flames burned low. The walls weren't just thick for protection against enemies or weather, They were thermal batteries, storing and releasing energy in carefully calculated cycles. The construction of these walls was an art form, stones selected not just for durability, but for thermal properties, arranged in patterns that maximized heat absorption while maintaining structural integrity. Sealed with mortars that conducted heat efficiently while blocking cold air infiltration. Every element designed to work together in a complex system of thermal regulation. Beds weren't just places to sleep, but survival pods designed for maximum heat retention, built like wooden boxes with thick curtains that could be drawn completely closed, creating warm cocoons within cold rooms, microenvironments where body heat could accumulate and be preserved throughout the long winter nights. The beds were often elevated off the ground to avoid the coldest air that settled near the floor, but the space underneath wasn't wasted. It served as storage for clothing and blankets that would be pre-warmed by the heat rising from below, and created an insulating air gap that prevented cold from seeping up through floorboards, every inch of space designed with thermal efficiency in mind. The mattress construction was a science in itself, stuffed with carefully selected materials that each served multiple purposes. Straw provided bulk and insulation while being readily available and easily replaced. Feathers, when available, created loft that trapped warm air while remaining lightweight, but it was the dried herbs mixed throughout that revealed the true sophistication of medieval bedding. Lavender didn't just smell pleasant. It actively repelled insects that could carry disease, keeping the bed free from pests that might bite sleeping occupants or infest stored clothing. Rosemary not only purified the air, but was believed to enhance memory and prevent nightmares, helping sleep be more restful and restorative during stressful times. Sweet woodruff acted as a natural insect repellent, while also providing a subtle, calming fragrance. Each herb chosen, not just for comfort but for specific beneficial properties. The deep layers of straw weren't simply padding, but formed a complex insulation system, trapping body heat in countless small air pockets, creating a natural warming system that could maintain comfortable temperatures for hours. The arrangement of materials in specific layers, with the heaviest insulation at the bottom and the finest, most heat-conductive materials at the top, showed understanding of thermal dynamics that would impress modern engineers. And then there were the warming stones, a technology so simple it seems obvious, yet so effective it bordered on magical. Large river rocks, selected not randomly, but according to strict criteria. Stones that could hold heat, without cracking from thermal expansion. That were dense enough to store significant energy, but not so dense that they took too long to heat. That had been tested by generations of use to ensure they wouldn't explode from steam pressure. The selection of these stones was a specialized skill. Experienced practitioners could tell by touch and weight, and even sound, which rocks would serve best, testing them first with small fires to ensure they wouldn't shatter when subjected to intense heat, grading them by size and thermal properties for different uses throughout the house, wrapped in wool cloth that had been specially prepared, often treated with lanolin to improve its insulating properties. These stones were heated by the fire throughout the evening, and then carefully transported to beds before sleep. They would stay warm until dawn, like medieval hot water bottles, but more effective and longer lasting than anything we use today. Different stones were used for different purposes. Smaller ones that heated quickly for warming hands and feet that had grown numb from cold, medium-sized stones for placing at the center of beds where they could warm entire bodies, large stones that took hours to heat fully but then radiated warmth for most of the night. each size and type stored in specific locations and rotated through heating cycles to ensure continuous warmth. The wool wrapping wasn't just for protection against burns, but was often treated with aromatic herbs and oils, providing aromatherapy benefits that helped with sleep and stress relief during the most difficult months. The wrapping also distributed heat more evenly, preventing hot spots that could cause burns while ensuring that warmth spread gradually throughout the bed. Children learned early the art of sleeping in layers, not just of clothes, but of people, understanding that shared body heat was the most reliable and renewable source of warmth available. Entire families shared beds, not from poverty, but from thermal efficiency, creating human heating systems that could survive the coldest nights. But this wasn't random crowding or simple desperation. There was sophisticated strategy in the arrangement. The warmest sleepers, usually the adults in their prime, were placed at the edges where they would be most exposed to cold air. The coldest sleepers, often the elderly or very young, were positioned in the center where they could benefit from heat radiating from all sides. Children with their faster metabolisms and higher body temperatures often served as living heat sources, helping to warm grandparents whose circulation had slowed with age. The animals, those essential partners in medieval survival, were integrated into the home's thermal system with the same careful planning applied to every other element. Cows and sheep weren't kept outside in winter, not just for their protection, but because they were living furnaces, generating heat that could warm entire households if properly channeled. They lived in the ground floor of the house, in what was called the byre, a space designed to maximize the benefit of their body heat while maintaining sanitation and air quality for the humans living above. Their breath and body warmth rose through carefully positioned gaps in the floorboards, naturally warming the human living space, while the animals themselves stayed protected from the worst of the weather. Can you imagine the comfort? Falling asleep to the gentle, rhythmic breathing of cattle below, their warm presence providing not just physical heat, but psychological comfort. The reassurance that came from knowing your family's precious livestock were safe and warm, that the source of your milk and meat and leather was thriving despite the cold outside. The sounds of the animals, their quiet lowing and shuffling, the rustle of straw as they settled for the night, provided a constant, living soundtrack that many medieval people found more soothing than silence. Evidence that life continued, that the cycle of seasons would turn again, that spring would eventually come with its promise of new births and fresh milk and the return of abundance. The arrangement of furniture within these carefully designed thermal environments was also strategic. Every piece positioned to maximize heat distribution and minimize cold infiltration. Tables and benches placed to create barriers against drafts, to direct warm airflow towards seating and sleeping areas, to block cold air that might seep in through doors or around windows. Heavy tapestries and wall hangings weren't just decorative, but served as movable insulation, repositioned based on weather conditions and seasonal needs. In the coldest months, they might be layered for maximum thermal protection. In milder periods, they could be rearranged to allow more air circulation while still maintaining warmth where it was needed most. Windows, when they existed at all, were small and designed to be completely shuttered during the worst weather. But medieval builders were surprisingly sophisticated about managing natural light. They positioned these openings to capture maximum sunlight during winter's short days, understanding that even weak winter sun could provide meaningful heat if properly harnessed. Some homes featured reflective surfaces, polished metal plates or light-colored stones, positioned to redirect sunlight deeper into living spaces, amplifying the warming effect of precious daylight and extending its reach to areas that might otherwise remain cold and dark throughout the short winter days. And when the truly brutal nights came, when frost formed inside the windows despite all precautions, when breath froze in the air, and even the warmest bed seemed inadequate, that's when the most ingenious warming method of all emerged from medieval wisdom. Shared body heat, not just among family members but among entire communities. The practice of gathering multiple households in the strongest, best insulated cottage during the worst storms. sometimes 20 or 30 people crowded into spaces designed for single families, creating human heating systems that could maintain life-sustaining warmth even when individual homes might have failed. These weren't random gatherings born of desperation, but carefully planned survival strategies. The host family was chosen based on multiple factors: the structural integrity of their home, the efficiency of their heating system, their ability to accommodate large numbers of people, their stores of food and fuel that could sustain a crowd through extended periods of harsh weather. Everyone contributed to these emergency gatherings, bringing food and fuel and blankets, offering skills and labor, sharing resources and stories and songs that helped maintain morale during the most difficult times. It was communal survival at its most essential, proof that medieval people understood something we have largely forgotten, that warmth isn't just about temperature or technology or individual comfort. It's about connection, community, the irreplaceable heat that comes from human hearts beating close together, from souls supporting each other through the darkest times, from the shared determination to survive and thrive no matter what winter might bring. Listen now, as I share with you the secrets that meant the difference between feast and famine. Between families that thrived through winter's long siege and those who faced the terrible specter of starvation. In our modern world of refrigerators and freezers, of canned goods and preservatives, we've forgotten the profound wisdom our ancestors possessed about keeping food safe and nourishing through months without harvest. They were chemists without laboratories, biologists without microscopes, masters of preservation who understood the delicate dance between beneficial microorganisms and deadly decay. Picture Martha, the village's most respected food keeper, a woman whose cellars were legendary for never losing a single precious morsel to rot or spoilage. Standing in her underground storage room on a crisp autumn morning, surrounded by the fruits of summer's labor, she begins the sacred work of transformation, turning perishable abundance into winter's salvation. Food preservation isn't just about keeping things from rotting, she tells her apprentices, young women whose families have entrusted them to learn these vital arts. It's about capturing summer's life force, holding it prisoner in salt and smoke and careful drying, so we can release it again when the world is dead and frozen. Every preserved apple, every salted ham, every fermented cabbage is a small victory over death itself. The science she practiced, though she wouldn't have called it that, was remarkably sophisticated. She understood that removing moisture prevented the growth of harmful organisms, that salt created an environment hostile to bacteria, that smoke contained compounds that actively prevented decay, that fermentation could transform simple vegetables into nutritional powerhouses that would sustain life through the darkest months. Salt was more precious than gold in many medieval communities, not for its flavor, but for its life-giving preservation properties. A family's salt stores were guarded as carefully as their silver, rationed with mathematical precision, used with the reverence reserved for sacred objects, because salt meant the difference between meat that would nourish and meat that would poison. The process of salt preservation was an art, requiring years to master. Too little salt and the meat would spoil, taking precious protein with it and potentially sickening those who ate it. Too much and the food became inedible, wasting both the salt and the sustenance it was meant to preserve. The balance had to be perfect, adjusted for the type of meat, the ambient temperature, the humidity levels, the length of time it needed. Martha knew that pork required different treatment than beef, that fatty cuts needed more salt than lean, that meat from older animals absorbed salt differently than that from young ones. She could tell by touch, by smell, by subtle changes in color, exactly how the preservation process was progressing, adjusting her techniques based on signs invisible to untrained eyes. But salt curing was just the beginning of medieval preservation mastery. Smoking added another layer of protection, while imparting flavors that made preserved foods not just edible, but enjoyable. The selection of wood for smoking was a science in itself, each type imparting different flavors and preservation properties. Oak provided steady heat and mild flavor, while its smoke contained high levels of preservative compounds. Applewood gave a subtle sweetness that complemented pork perfectly, while also providing excellent antimicrobial properties. Pine was avoided for meat, but used for fish in some regions, its resinous smoke creating an almost impermeable barrier against decay. The smoking process wasn't simply hanging meat over a fire and hoping for the best. Temperature had to be carefully controlled. Too hot, and the outside would cook while the inside remained vulnerable to spoilage. Too cool, and the smoke wouldn't penetrate deeply enough to provide protection. The ideal temperature range, maintained through careful tending of specialized smokehouses, ensured that preservation compounds penetrated every fiber, while moisture was slowly drawn out. Young Thomas learned from his father the art of maintaining the smokehouse. How to read the color of smoke to determine if the fire was burning correctly. How to adjust airflow to maintain optimal temperature. How to tell by the sheen on hanging hams whether they were absorbing smoke properly or needed repositioning. The smoke must be thin and blue, his father taught, like morning mist over the river. Thick white smoke means the fire is too cool. Black smoke means it's too hot. The blue smoke carries the spirits that keep the meat safe, that wrap around every piece like invisible armor against rot and decay. Drying was perhaps the oldest preservation method, practiced since humans first noticed that meat left in the sun became lighter and lasted longer. But medieval people had refined this simple observation into sophisticated techniques that maximize nutrition while minimizing spoilage risk. Vegetables were sliced to precise thicknesses, each type requiring different treatment. Onions cut into rings exactly 3 fingers wide would dry evenly without developing tough spots. Carrots sliced on an angle to increase surface area while maintaining structural integrity. Turnips scored in specific patterns that allowed moisture to escape while preventing the outside from hardening before the inside dried. The drying process itself followed strict protocols developed over centuries. Items were first blanched in boiling water mixed with salt and herbs, not just for flavor, but because this process deactivated enzymes that would otherwise cause deterioration. The blanching time varied by vegetable. Too long, and nutrients would leach away. Too short, and the enzymes would remain active. After blanching came the careful arrangement on drying racks, positioned to maximize airflow while protecting from rain and dew. The racks themselves were works of art, constructed from woods that wouldn't impart unwanted flavors, designed to be easily moved, to follow the sun or avoid sudden weather changes. Mary, known throughout 3 villages for her perfectly dried vegetables, could predict weather changes days in advance by subtle shifts in how her drying foods behaved. When the apple rings curl tighter than usual, she would say, rain is coming within 2 days. When the bean pods crack more loudly, a dry spell approaches. The food tells us everything if we know how to listen. But perhaps the most remarkable preservation technique, one that modern science has only recently begun to fully appreciate, was fermentation, the transformation of simple cabbage into sauerkraut, of milk into cheese, of grain into beer. These weren't just ways to preserve food, but to enhance its nutritional value in ways medieval people understood intuitively, even if they couldn't explain the science. The fermentation of cabbage into sauerkraut was a particularly vital winter survival technique. Fresh cabbage might last a few weeks in cold storage, but fermented cabbage could remain not just edible but increasingly nutritious for months. The fermentation process created beneficial bacteria that aided digestion, produced vitamins that weren't present in fresh cabbage, and created an acidic environment that prevented harmful organisms from taking hold. The process required precise conditions and careful monitoring. Cabbage was shredded to exact specifications. Too thick and the center wouldn't ferment properly. Too thin and it would turn to mush before preservation was complete. Salt was added in carefully measured amounts, enough to draw out moisture and create the proper environment for beneficial bacteria. Not so much that it would inhibit the fermentation process. Emma, the village's fermentation expert, treated her crocks like living beings, which, in a sense, they were, teeming with billions of beneficial microorganisms working to transform simple vegetables into winter medicine. She could tell by smell alone how the fermentation was progressing, whether more salt was needed, whether the temperature was optimal, whether the batch would be ready in 3 weeks or 4. "Listen to the bubbles," she would tell her daughters as they learned the craft. They sing different songs at different stages. Quick and violent at first, as the good spirits establish their dominion, then slower and steadier as they settle into their work. When the bubbling almost stops, when you have to put your ear to the crock to hear it, then you know the transformation is complete. Root cellars were the refrigerators of the medieval world, but far more sophisticated than simple holes in the ground. These underground storage spaces were marvels of environmental engineering, maintaining constant temperature and humidity levels that kept produce fresh for months without any external power source. The construction of a proper root cellar required understanding of soil types, water table levels, drainage patterns, and thermal dynamics that rival modern engineering. The depth had to be precisely calculated, deep enough to benefit from Earth's insulating properties, but not so deep that water would seep in. The orientation considered prevailing winds and seasonal sun angles. William, master of root cellar construction, could determine the perfect location by observing where frost formed last in autumn and melted first in spring, by noting where certain plants grew most vigorously, by feeling the earth with bare feet to sense temperature variations invisible to others. "The earth herself will tell you where she wants to shelter your food," he explained to those seeking his expertise. "Where the cold goes deep but not too deep, where the moisture is present but not excessive, where the ground breathes properly to prevent the stagnation that breeds rot. You must read her signals like a love letter written in soil and stone." Inside these cellars, organization was critical. Different vegetables required different conditions and couldn't be stored together without affecting each other's longevity. Apples gave off gases that would cause potatoes to sprout prematurely. Onions needed more air circulation than root vegetables. Cabbages required cooler temperatures than squash. The storage methods themselves were ingenious. Carrots and parsnips buried in boxes of damp sand that maintained perfect moisture levels. Apples wrapped individually in straw and arranged on shelves so no two touched, preventing the spread of rot if one began to decay. Potatoes stored in complete darkness to prevent the development of poisonous compounds that light would trigger. Sarah, keeper of the manor's root cellars, had developed systems of rotation and inspection that ensured nothing was wasted. "First in, first out," she would chant as she worked, moving older stores to the front while adding new supplies to the back. Her daily inspections were methodical, checking for signs of decay, adjusting ventilation, monitoring temperature and humidity with techniques passed down through generations. She knew that different varieties of the same vegetable had vastly different storage properties, that some apples would last until spring, while others needed to be used by midwinter. that certain potato varieties developed sweetness in storage, while others remained starchy. This knowledge influenced not just storage methods, but planting decisions made months before harvest. The preservation of dairy products presented unique challenges in a world without refrigeration. Yet medieval people developed techniques that not only preserved milk and eggs, but transformed them into products that were often more nutritious and digestible than their fresh counterparts. Cheesemaking was perhaps the most sophisticated preservation art, requiring understanding of temperature, acidity, moisture, and bacterial cultures that wouldn't be scientifically explained for centuries. Yet, medieval cheesemakers achieved consistent results through careful observation and meticulous technique. Agnes, the village cheesemaker, worked in rhythms dictated by temperature and humidity rather than clocks. She could tell by touching the milk whether it was the right temperature for adding rennet, by observing the curd formation whether the acidity was correct, by feeling the texture whether it was ready for the next stage of processing. The milk must be as warm as a calf's mouth, she taught her apprentices. No warmer or the curds will be tough. No cooler or they won't form properly. The saints who watch over cheese making are particular about temperature. Displease them, and your cheese will weep bitter tears or grow hard as stone. Different cheeses required different aging conditions, some needing cool, humid caves where they could develop their characteristic rinds, others requiring dry storage where they would form hard, protective shells. The turning and washing schedules were as precise as any modern industrial process, each cheese receiving exactly the attention it needed to develop properly. The waxing or cloth wrapping of cheeses for long-term storage was another art form. The wax had to be the right temperature, hot enough to create a perfect seal, but not so hot it would cook the cheese surface. The cloth wrappings were often treated with herbs that would prevent mold while allowing the cheese to breathe properly. Eggs presented their own preservation challenges, solved through various ingenious methods that could keep them edible for months. Water glassing, coating eggs in a solution of sodium silicate, created an impermeable barrier that prevented air from entering and causing spoilage. Eggs could also be preserved in salt, pickled in vinegar, or coated in fat or wax. Margaret had her own special technique, passed down from her grandmother's grandmother. She would coat fresh eggs in a mixture of butter and herbs, each egg carefully inspected for even the tiniest crack that would make it unsuitable for long storage, then pack them in boxes of oats that would absorb any moisture while cushioning the delicate shells. An egg is like a promise, she would say while working. Handle it roughly and it breaks. Ignore it and it spoils. But treat it with proper respect and it will sustain you through the darkest days. Each preserved egg is summer's sunshine captured in a shell, waiting to bring life and nourishment when the world outside is dead. The community aspect of food preservation was just as important as individual family efforts. Certain tasks required more labor than a single household could provide, leading to communal work parties that combined necessity with social bonding. Apple processing days brought entire villages together, some peeling, some coring, some slicing, some tending the fires, where apple butter slowly cooked down to concentrated sweetness. Children would run between stations, carrying messages and supplies. Elderly people would supervise and share stories of previous year's harvests. These gatherings served multiple purposes beyond simple labor sharing. Knowledge was exchanged as experienced preservers shared techniques with newcomers. Young people learned by observation and participation rather than formal instruction. Social bonds were strengthened through shared work and shared meals. The songs sung during these communal preservation sessions weren't just for entertainment. Many contained mnemonic devices for remembering important timing or techniques. Verses about when to add salt. Choruses marking stirring intervals. Refrains reminding workers to check temperature or consistency. When the apple butter coats the spoon like morning dew on grass. when the stirring paddle stands upright in the mass, when a drop on cold stone holds its shape and doesn't run. Then you know the cooking's properly done. These rhymes, sung to traditional melodies, ensured that crucial information was preserved and transmitted as carefully as the food itself. By the time the first serious snows began to fall, a well-prepared medieval household had transformed summer's bounty into a carefully orchestrated system of survival. The root cellar filled with vegetables in perfect storage conditions. The smokehouse hung with hams and sausages that would provide precious protein. The pantry lined with crocks of fermented vegetables, rich in nutrients. The cheese cave stocked with wheels that would age to perfection, just as fresh food became a distant memory. This wasn't just food storage. It was a form of time travel, bringing summer's abundance forward into winter's scarcity. It was alchemy, transforming perishable plenty into preserved sustenance. It was community, binding families and villages together through shared knowledge and mutual support. And perhaps most importantly, it was hope. Each jar of preserves, each wrapped cheese, each bundle of dried herbs represented faith in the future, confidence that spring would come again, determination that the family would be there to greet it. The very act of preservation was an act of optimism, a declaration that life would continue, that there would be mouths to feed and bodies to nourish when the world turned green again. In our modern world of global supply chains and year-round availability, we've lost touch with the profound satisfaction of opening a jar of summer preserves in the depths of winter, of cutting into a cheese that has been patiently aging since the leaves were green, of reconstituting dried vegetables into stews that taste of sunshine and warmth, despite the howling wind outside. Medieval people understood something we've forgotten, that food is more than calories and nutrients. It's memory and hope and community combined. It's the taste of survival earned through planning and work and wisdom. It's the flavor of victory over forces that would destroy us, seasoned with the knowledge that we are stronger than winter, more persistent than hunger, more clever than the cold death that stalks outside our doors. Now, settle deeper into warmth, and let me tell you about the hidden blessing within winter's curse. The way medieval people transformed the season of death into a time of creation. How they turned forced indoor confinement into opportunities for craft and connection that sustained not just their bodies, but their spirits through the darkest months. When the last harvest was safely stored, and the first serious snows made outdoor work impossible, when the very air seemed to freeze solid, and daylight became a brief visitor between long nights. That's when medieval homes transformed into workshops, studios, schools, and storytelling circles that hummed with purposeful activity from dawn to dusk and beyond. Idle hands in winter are death's playground, old Martha would say as she organized the household's winter work, her weathered fingers already busy with wool and spindle despite the early morning darkness. Every moment we waste is food unearned, warmth uncreated, future suffering uninvited. Winter rewards the industrious and punishes the lazy with a cruelty summer never knows. But this wasn't the grinding labor of planting and harvesting. This was the careful, skilled work that transformed raw materials into the tools of civilization, that turned sheep's wool into warm clothing, that shaped wood into furniture and tools, that created the 1,000 small items that made life not just possible, but comfortable in a world without factories or stores. Picture the great room of a medieval cottage on a typical winter morning. The fire, crackling in the hearth, casts dancing shadows on walls where tools hang in careful order. In one corner, Grandfather Thomas sits at his workbench, his hands moving with practiced precision as he carves a wooden bowl from a chunk of oak, saved specifically for this purpose, dried slowly over 2 summers to prevent cracking, selected for its grain pattern that would make the finished bowl both beautiful and durable. The sound of his knife against wood creates a rhythm. Scrape, scrape, pause, scrape, scrape, pause, a meditation in motion that he's performed thousands of times before. Each stroke removes exactly the right amount of wood, no more, no less. Following the grain's natural patterns, working with the wood rather than against it, creating something that will last generations if properly cared for. The wood tells you what it wants to become, he murmurs to young William, his grandson who watches with rapt attention. This piece has been waiting inside this oak since before your father was born, waiting for someone to release it. See how the grain curves here? That's where the bowl's rim wants to be. And this knot? That will become a feature, not a flaw. A beauty mark that makes this bowl unique in all the world. Nearby, Grandmother Ellen works at her great loom, a massive wooden structure that dominates an entire wall, its complexity rivaling any modern machine despite being powered entirely by human hands and feet. The loom isn't just a tool, but a family heirloom, passed down through generations, each woman adding her own improvements and modifications, each leaving her mark in both the physical structure and the patterns woven upon it. The rhythmic thump of the beater bar, the whisper of threads moving through heddles, the soft whoosh of the shuttle flying back and forth, these sounds create a music that fills the room with purposeful energy. Ellen's feet work the treadles in patterns so complex they seem like dancing, her hands moving in counterpoint, creating fabric that is both utilitarian and beautiful. Every thread must be perfect, she explains to her granddaughter Mary, who sits beside her learning. One weak thread and the whole cloth fails. One mistake in the pattern and it multiplies across the entire weave. But done properly, with patience and skill, this cloth will warm bodies not yet born, will swaddle babies and shroud elders, will be part of our family's story long after we're gone. The younger women of the household gather around the fire with their distaffs and spindles, transforming raw wool into thread through a process that seems simple but requires years to master. The wool has been carefully prepared, washed in precise temperatures to remove lanolin without felting, carded with specialized combs to align the fibers, dyed with plants gathered during summer and autumn for specific colors. Sarah, just 15 but already skilled at spinning, demonstrates for her younger sister how to maintain consistent tension, how to let the spindle's weight do the work while guiding the fibers with gentle fingers, how to create thread that is neither too thick nor too thin, neither over-twisted nor under-spun. The thread must be strong enough to hold, but gentle enough to bend, she recites, repeating words her mother taught her and her mother's mother before that. Like a good marriage, like a good life, too rigid and it breaks under pressure, too loose and it has no strength. The balance must be perfect. The spinning isn't just mechanical work, but social time. The women share gossip and news, discuss marriages and births, plan for spring and summer, tell stories that have been repeated so many times everyone knows them by heart, yet still finds comfort in their familiar rhythms. The spindles dance and twirl as voices rise and fall, creating a tapestry of sound that makes the long hours pass quickly. In another corner, young Robert learns the art of leatherworking from his Uncle James. The hides have been tanned using methods ancient even in medieval times. Soaked in solutions of oak bark and other materials that transform perishable skin into durable leather. The smell is pungent, but not unpleasant. Speaking of transformation and permanence, leather is honest, James explains as he shows Robert how to cut patterns. It shows every mistake, every moment of inattention. You cannot hide poor workmanship under leather as you might under cloth. But treated with respect, worked with skill, it becomes armor against the world, protecting our feet from stones, our hands from cold, our bodies from wind. The cutting must be precise, following patterns passed down through generations, but adapted for each individual's needs. No 2 feet are exactly alike. No 2 hands the same size. The leather worker must be part craftsman, part artist, part engineer, understanding not just how to cut and sew, but how bodies move, where stress points occur, how to create items that will conform to their user while maintaining their shape. Robert watches in fascination as his uncle's knife moves through the leather like butter, following lines that seem to exist only in James's mind, but result in pieces that fit together perfectly. The stitching that follows is equally precise, using sinew that's been carefully prepared to be both strong and flexible, creating seams that are watertight and nearly indestructible. Meanwhile, the children too young for such skilled work have their own winter tasks. They sort dried beans, removing stones and damaged specimens with fingers that grow more nimble each day. They polish metal tools with sand and cloth, preventing rust while learning the name and purpose of each implement. They practice their letters on smooth boards covered with a thin layer of beeswax, writing and erasing and writing again. Even the smallest children contribute. 4-year-old Anne sits by the fire, carefully picking apart old rope to create oakum for caulking. Her tiny fingers separate the fibers that will be mixed with tar to seal gaps in boats and buildings. 6-year-old John helps his mother by winding thread onto bobbins, counting as he goes to practice his numbers. No one is too young to be useful, their mother Catherine says firmly. No one too old to contribute. Winter tests us all equally, demands that we all work together. In summer, a lazy child might be overlooked, but in winter, laziness is selfishness, and selfishness in winter can kill. The organization of winter work follows patterns established over centuries, designed to maximize productivity while maintaining morale during the long, dark months. Tasks are rotated to prevent boredom. Heavy work alternates with light to prevent exhaustion. Solitary activities balance with communal ones to satisfy both introverts and extroverts. Monday might be devoted to spinning and weaving. Tuesday to woodworking and carving. Wednesday to leatherwork and tool repair. Thursday to food preparation and preservation. Friday to mending and sewing. Saturday to cleaning and organizing. Sunday reserved for rest and worship. And the vital spiritual sustenance that keeps hope alive. But within this structure lies endless variation and creativity. No 2 carved spoons are exactly alike, each reflecting its maker's personality and skill. No 2 pieces of embroidery follow exactly the same pattern, each woman adding her own flourishes and innovations. Even practical items like storage boxes and tool handles become opportunities for artistic expression. The decoration isn't mere vanity, but serves important psychological functions during the long winter months. Beautiful objects lift spirits when darkness presses close. Intricate patterns provide mental stimulation when the world outside offers only monotonous white. The act of creation itself becomes a form of resistance against winter's attempts to reduce life to mere survival. Peter, the household's most skilled woodcarver, works on a chest that will hold his daughter's dowry. The base structure is complete. Solid oak joined with techniques that require no nails or screws, yet will hold firm for centuries. Now comes the decoration. Vines and flowers emerging from the wood, as if growing naturally from the grain. Beauty is not separate from function, he explains to his apprentice. This chest must protect precious things from damp and insects and thieves. But it must also proclaim our family's skill, our prosperity, our hope for the future. When my daughter opens this chest 50 years from now, she'll remember her father's love carved into every leaf and petal. The metalworking that happens during winter is equally important. Iron tools need constant maintenance to prevent rust. Edges need sharpening. Broken implements need repair. The household's small forge glows with carefully tended fire as Mark the smith performs the alchemy of turning hard metal soft enough to shape. The sound of hammer on anvil rings through the cottage, a percussion that punctuates all other acts. Iron has its own will, he tells those watching. Try to force it, and it becomes brittle. Work with its nature, and it becomes stronger than stone. Like children, like communities, like life itself. Strength comes not from force, but from understanding. The products of winter work go far beyond meeting immediate needs. They create wealth in a world where money is scarce. A well-carved bowl might trade for a ham. A length of fine cloth could secure enough grain for a month. Leather goods, metal tools, wooden implements all become currency in an economy based on barter and mutual support. But more than economic value, winter work creates identity and legacy. The patterns woven into cloth carry family histories, record marriages and births, commemorate victories and mourn losses. The tools carved and decorated will be passed down through generations, each nick and scratch telling stories of work accomplished and challenges overcome. Young Agnes works on her first major embroidery project, an altar cloth for the village church. Her mother and aunts guide her, but the design is her own, incorporating symbols that tell the story of their community. The wheat stalks represent the harvest that sustains them. The oak leaves honor the forest that provides wood and shelter. The running deer speaks of the wild food that supplements their diet. The stars remind all who see it that even in the darkest night, light endures. Your stitches will outlive you, her aunt reminds her. People not yet born will pray before this cloth, will find comfort in its beauty when their own winters seem endless. Stitch with care, for you are stitching yourself into the future. As the winter deepens and the days grow shorter, the pace of work actually increases rather than decreases. There's an urgency born from understanding that every moment of daylight is precious, that lamp oil and candles must be conserved, that working by firelight strains eyes and produces inferior results. The household rises before dawn, beginning work in darkness and continuing until they can no longer see. Meals are taken quickly, often while working. Hands busy with spindle or needle, even while eating. Conversation flows around and through the work, binding the activities together into a single, continuous flow of productivity. But this isn't the grim, forced labor of slaves or serfs. It's the purposeful activity of free people ensuring their own survival and prosperity. There's pride in the work, competition to produce the finest goods, anticipation of the praise that excellent craftsmanship will bring. Young couples work together on items for their future homes, spinning and weaving the linens they'll need, carving the bowls and spoons they'll use, creating the physical foundation for lives they plan to build together. Their working hours become courtship rituals, opportunities to demonstrate skill and compatibility. Thomas watches Catherine as she spins, admiring the steady rhythm of her work, the fine, even thread she produces without apparent effort. She, in turn, observes his woodworking, noting the patience with which he approaches each piece, the care he takes to achieve smooth finishes. In their work, they see previews of their life together, promises of competence and dedication that matter more than pretty words. The stories told during winter work sessions serve multiple purposes. They entertain, pushing back the boredom that could make long hours unbearable. They educate, passing on history and values and practical knowledge. They inspire, reminding workers that their ancestors survived worse conditions through skill and determination. Old Margaret, the village's master storyteller, times her tales to the rhythm of whatever work is being done. Long stories for spinning and weaving, short ones for tasks requiring concentration. Funny stories when energy flags, serious ones when attention wanders. Her repertoire seems endless, though many suspect she creates new variations of old tales to keep them fresh. In the Winter of the Three Wolves, she begins, her voice taking on the special cadence reserved for important tales. When snow fell so deep that houses disappeared and only church steeples marked where villages lay, our great-grandmothers saved the village through their weaving. The story unfolds as spindles twirl and looms clack, telling of women who wove cloth so fine it could trade for grain from distant lands, who worked day and night to create enough to feed their families, who discovered that mixing nettle fibers with wool created thread strong enough for rope, yet soft enough for clothing. Every story contains kernels of practical wisdom wrapped in narrative, teaching without preaching, preserving knowledge in forms memory can easily retain. The children absorb these lessons without realizing they're learning, filing away information that might someday save their lives. As winter reaches its deepest point, when it seems spring will never come, when supplies run low and spirits flag, the winter work takes on almost religious significance. Each completed project becomes an act of faith, a declaration that there will be a future worth preparing for. The finished goods accumulate, carefully stored and cataloged. Shelves fill with carved bowls and spoons. Chests overflow with woven cloth. Bags of leather goods stand ready for spring trading. Each item represents hours of labor, transformed into tangible wealth. But more than that, each represents hope made manifest. See what winter has given us, Ellen says as she surveys the household's production. Not taken, given, for without these long, dark months, when would we have time for such creation? When would young ones learn these skills? When would families work so closely together? Winter forces us indoors, but in doing so, it forces us together, forces us to create, forces us to become more than we were. The children who began winter, barely able to hold a spindle properly, now spin thread fine enough for delicate embroidery. Young men who struggled with simple carving now produce pieces that would grace any table. Skills that seemed impossible in autumn have become second nature by late winter. And in this transformation lies winter's greatest gift, not the physical goods produced, valuable though they are. Not even the skills learned, important though they will prove. But the confidence gained, the patience developed, the understanding that humans can create beauty and utility from raw materials and determination. When spring finally arrives, when doors open and work moves back outdoors, the household emerges transformed, not weakened by winter's trials, but strengthened, not impoverished by months without income, but enriched by goods produced, not fractured by forced proximity, but bonded more closely through shared labor. The rhythms established during winter work continue to influence summer activities. The patience learned at loom and workbench applies to field and garden. The cooperation developed indoors extends to outdoor tasks. The stories told become part of family lore, repeated to new generations who will face their own winters. And in quiet moments, when summer's heat makes winter seem like a distant dream, hands will unconsciously reach for spindle or carving knife, muscle memory seeking the comfort of winter work, missing perhaps the focused purpose those dark months provided, the clarity that comes from knowing exactly what must be done, the satisfaction of creating something from nothing while the world outside sleeps under snow. For medieval people, understood what we have forgotten in our climate-controlled world. Winter isn't just something to be endured. It's something to be used, transformed, conquered, not through resistance, but through acceptance, through finding the opportunities hidden within its challenges, through recognizing that the same season that brings death also brings time, and time properly. Close your eyes and breathe deeply as I share with you the ancient wisdom of winter healing, the profound knowledge that kept medieval people alive when a simple cold could become pneumonia, when a minor injury could lead to death, when the nearest physician might be days away through impassable snow. In the depths of winter, when wolves howled outside and frost painted windows with crystalline art, the village wise woman became more precious than gold. Her cottage, fragrant with hanging herbs and mysterious preparations, served as pharmacy, hospital, and sanctuary for all who suffered. Picture old Marjorie, her hair white as fresh snow, her hands gnarled but gentle, moving through her cottage with purpose, despite her 70 winters. She is checking her stores of medicines, preparations made during summer and autumn when plants held their greatest power, dried and preserved with the same care given to food. For these herbs were food of a different kind, food for the body's battles against disease and injury. Every plant has its purpose, she whispers to young Anna, her chosen apprentice. Every root and leaf and flower contains gifts from the earth herself. But you must know when to gather, how to prepare, when to use. A medicine given wrongly is poison. A poison given wisely is medicine. The difference lies in knowledge, passed down through generations of women who learned these truths through trial and prayer and careful observation. The medieval understanding of illness differed greatly from our modern germ theory, yet their practical treatments often worked remarkably well. They spoke of humors and miasmas, of hot and cold diseases, of the body's vital forces needing balance. But beneath these explanations lay sophisticated observations about what actually helped people heal. Feverfew for headaches, willow bark for pain and fever, comfrey for broken bones, garlic for infections. These weren't random choices, but the result of centuries of experimentation. Wise women knew that willow bark contained something that eased pain, though they couldn't have named salicylic acid. They understood that honey prevented wound infection, though the concept of antimicrobial properties was centuries away. Marjorie's shelves held rows of carefully labeled jars and bundles, each container marked not just with contents, but with gathering dates and moon phases. For medieval healers believed strongly in the influence of celestial bodies on medicinal potency. Modern science might scoff. But modern science has also discovered that many plants do indeed vary in their chemical composition, based on growing conditions and harvest timing. This is meadowsweet, she explains, holding up a bundle of dried flowers, gathered at dawn after 3 days without rain, when the flowers were fully open, but before the heat of day drew out their virtue. For winter fevers and the aching joints that cold brings, steep 1 handful in water just below boiling, never boiling, for that destroys its power. Let the patient drink while warm but not hot. It eases pain and brings down fever while allowing the body to fight its battles. The preparation methods were as important as the herbs themselves. Teas, tinctures, poultices, salves. Each had specific uses and required different techniques. A tea might extract certain healing compounds while a tincture preserved others. A poultice could draw out infection while a salve protected and healed. Young Anna watches as Marjorie prepares a cough syrup, layering wild cherry bark and elecampane root with honey in a glazed pot. The honey draws out the medicine from the plants, Marjorie explains, while adding its own healing powers. This will ease the worst winter cough, quiet the spasms that keep sufferers awake, allow rest that brings healing. But mark well, never use if there's blood in the sputum. Then we need different medicines, stronger ones. The diagnostic skills of medieval healers were surprisingly sophisticated. Without thermometers, they learned to judge fever by subtle changes in skin texture and color. Without stethoscopes, they detected lung problems by placing an ear to the chest and interpreting the sounds within. They read the body like a book, noting changes in urine, stool, skin, eyes, tongue, each sign contributing to their understanding of what ailed their patients. "Feel here," Marjorie instructs Anna, guiding her hands to a patient's throat. The swelling tells us infection, but is it hot or cold? Does it pulse with the heartbeat or remain still? Is the skin tight or loose? Each tells us different things, requires different treatments. Hot swelling needs cooling herbs. Cold swelling needs warming. The body tells us what it needs, if we know how to listen. Winter brought specific health challenges that required specialized responses. Frostbite threatened fingers and toes. Chilblains tormented those who worked in cold and damp. Chest infections settled deep in lungs already challenged by smoke from constantly burning fires. Joint pain increased as cold and damp penetrated aging bones. For frostbite, Marjorie had protocols refined over decades. Never warm too quickly, she would warn those bringing in victims from the cold. The flesh must return to life slowly, like spring returning to frozen earth. Too fast, and the damage increases. Wrap in cloths soaked in cool water, gradually warming. Add herbs that increase blood flow, birch leaf, ginger if we have it, rosemary to prevent the flesh from dying. The cottage served as a teaching hospital where Anna learned through observation and practice. She watched Marjorie lance boils with tools cleaned in boiling water and strong alcohol. Observed the careful stitching of wounds with thread made from sheep intestines. Learned to set broken bones using splints carved specifically for different limbs. A healer must have steady hands, but a steadier heart, Marjorie taught. You'll see suffering that breaks your soul, deaths you cannot prevent. Pain you cannot fully ease, but you must remain calm, confident. Your presence alone can heal or harm. If you panic, your patient panics. If you despair, they despair. Be the rock they cling to in the storm of illness. The psychological aspects of healing were well understood. Marjorie knew that fear and despair could kill as surely as any disease. She used ritual and ceremony to build confidence, prayers and blessings to invoke higher powers, stories of recovery to inspire hope. Her very presence, calm and assured, served as medicine for troubled spirits. Medieval healers also understood the importance of isolation for contagious diseases, though they explained it differently than we would. Bad air from one patient could affect another, so those with certain illnesses were kept separate. Windows were opened despite the cold to let in fresh spirits and release stale humors. Bedding was burned after certain diseases, rooms scrubbed with strong herbs and vinegar. The herbal preparations went far beyond simple teas and tinctures. Marjorie made pills by mixing powdered herbs with honey and flour, created suppositories for ailments requiring internal treatment, compounded complex medicines requiring dozens of ingredients and weeks of preparation. Her most prized possession was a manuscript, hand-copied and illustrated, containing recipes passed down through generations. Each page represented centuries of accumulated wisdom. recipes for everything from treating arrow wounds to easing childbirth, managing fevers to mending broken bones. This book contains the suffering and wisdom of all who came before, she tells Anna solemnly. Each recipe was bought with someone's pain, refined through someone's recovery or death. Treat it with the reverence it deserves. Add to it what you learn, but never change what's proven without great cause. Winter pregnancies presented particular challenges. Women who would give birth before spring needed special care. Marjorie prepared strengthening tonics, herbs to prevent early labor, medicines to ease the discomforts of carrying a child while battling winter's hardships. She kept a special store of herbs for childbirth preparations that could speed slow labors, ease pain without endangering mother or child, stop excessive bleeding, fight the childbed fever that claims so many new mothers. Her presence at a birth doubled a woman's chances of survival, knowledge that made her welcome in every home despite superstitions about wise women. The relationship between nutrition and health was well understood, though expressed in different terms than modern medicine would use. Marjorie prescribed specific foods for specific ailments: bone broth for weakness, liver for pale complexions, fermented cabbage for digestive problems. Her dietary prescriptions often matched modern nutritional science. Intuitive understanding developed through careful observation. In winter, the body needs different foods than summer, she explained. More fat to keep warm, more preserved vegetables to prevent the bleeding gums, more fermented foods to keep the gut healthy when fresh foods are scarce. A proper diet is the first medicine. An improper one invites illness to take residence. The medicine wasn't just about treating illness, but preventing it. Marjorie prepared tonics to strengthen the body before winter's worst. Immune-boosting preparations we would recognize today: elderberry syrup, fire cider, herbal vinegars rich in minerals. She understood that a strong body resisted disease better than a weak one. Children received special attention, their developing bodies more vulnerable to winter's challenges. Marjorie made special preparations, gentler versions of adult medicines, syrups that tasted pleasant enough for suspicious young palates. She knew which herbs were safe for infants, which could harm developing bodies, knowledge that made her indispensable to worried mothers. The spiritual and physical aspects of healing intertwined inextricably. Prayers accompanied medicines, blessings sealed poultices, holy water mixed with herbal preparations. This wasn't mere superstition, but recognition that healing involved more than physical remedies, that faith and hope played vital roles in recovery. The body and spirit are not separate, Marjorie taught. What troubles one affects the other. A guilty conscience can prevent physical healing. A diseased body can darken the brightest spirit. We must treat both, must consider the whole person, not just the symptoms they present. As winter deepened and calls for help increased, Marjorie and Anna often traveled through snow and storm to reach the sick. These journeys were dangerous, but refusing to go meant certain death for some patients. They wrapped themselves in layers of wool, carried medicines in special containers designed to prevent freezing, used walking sticks that could test ice thickness on frozen streams. The payment for healing services reflected medieval economic realities. Rarely was coin exchanged. Instead, families paid with what they had: a chicken, a measure of grain, a length of cloth, labor promised for spring. Sometimes payment was deferred indefinitely, the debt becoming part of complex webs of mutual obligation that bound communities together. Marjorie kept careful mental accounts, not for collection, but for understanding. Knowing who owed what helped her gauge the economic health of the community, predict where malnutrition might strike, identify families who might need help but were too proud to ask. The knowledge transmission happened constantly, not just through formal teaching but through countless small moments. Anna learned to read the color of urine, the quality of pulse, the subtle signs that distinguished one fever from another. She absorbed not just facts, but attitudes, approaches, the indefinable qualities that separated competent healers from truly gifted ones. "You're learning the easy part," Marjorie told her after a particularly successful treatment. "The herbs, the preparations, the techniques, these can be taught. The hard part is learning when to intervene and when to let nature work, when to give hope and when to prepare families for loss, when to fight death and when to help it come gently." The wise woman's role extended beyond physical healing. She served as counselor for troubled minds, mediator for family disputes, keeper of secrets that could destroy lives if revealed. Her cottage became a sanctuary where people could speak freely, knowing their words would go no further. Winter's isolation exacerbated mental suffering. Marjorie treated melancholy with the same seriousness as physical ailments, prescribing herbs like St. John's wort, recommending activities to lift spirits, sometimes simply listening as people poured out troubles they could share nowhere else. "The darkness of winter can enter the soul," she explained to Anna, "especially for those who've lost loved ones, who face poverty, who carry heavy secrets. Sometimes the best medicine is an understanding ear, a gentle touch, the knowledge that someone cares whether they live or die." The veterinary knowledge was equally important. Sick animals could mean starvation for entire families. Marjorie treated cows with infected udders, horses with colic, sheep with foot rot. Her understanding of animal anatomy and illness often exceeded that of formally trained farriers. She taught Anna to approach animals with the same calm confidence used with humans, to read their symptoms despite the inability to describe pain, to prepare medicines adjusted for different metabolisms and body weights. This knowledge made her valuable even to those who might otherwise distrust a wise woman. As winter neared its end, as supplies of medicines ran low and spirits flagged, the healing work became even more critical. This was when bodies weakened by months of cold and limited diet became most vulnerable. When a simple cold could carry off those who might have survived it in autumn, Marjorie rationed her remaining medicines carefully, treating the most serious cases, while teaching families to use common household items for minor ailments. Onions for chest congestion, salt water for sore throats, willow bark tea for minor pains. She multiplied her effectiveness by creating dozens of auxiliary healers who could handle simple problems. The first signs of spring brought new challenges. Bodies adjusted to winter's cold could react badly to warming temperatures. Floods from melting snow could contaminate water supplies. People, weakened by winter's hardships, were vulnerable to new diseases brought by returning travelers. But spring also brought renewal of medicine supplies. Fresh herbs could be gathered, depleted stores replenished, new preparations begun for the next winter's challenges. The cycle continued, each year adding to the accumulated wisdom, each generation building on the knowledge of those before. In our modern world of antibiotics and advanced surgery, it's easy to dismiss medieval medicine as primitive superstition. But those who survived winter after winter, who raised healthy children despite incredible hardships, who maintained community health without any of our technological advantages, they knew things we've forgotten. They understood that healing is as much art as science, that the healer's presence can be as important as the medicine given, that treating the whole person matters more than addressing isolated symptoms, that community support and individual resilience are the strongest medicines of all. And perhaps most importantly, they knew that knowledge carefully preserved and transmitted, wisdom earned through suffering and success, careful observation combined with compassionate action. These are the tools that allow humans to survive and thrive despite all the challenges nature presents. The wise woman's cottage, with its herbs and mysteries, its suffering and healing, its accumulated wisdom and gentle compassion, stood as a beacon of hope in winter's darkest days. Proof that knowledge and kindness could triumph over cold and disease, that humans could create light in darkness, warmth in the coldest season, healing in the midst of death itself. Let your mind drift now to the intricate web of relationships that made medieval winter survival possible. For no family, however prepared, no individual, however skilled, could survive the darkest months alone. It was the bonds between people, the unwritten rules of mutual aid, the complex systems of obligation and support, that transformed scattered households into resilient communities capable of weathering any storm. Picture the village of Thornwick on a brutal January evening. Snow has fallen for 3 days straight. Drifts reach the eaves of cottages. Paths between homes have disappeared entirely. The wind howls like a living thing, seeking entry through every tiny gap, testing every seal, probing for weakness. In the cottage of William the Reeve, the village headman, a different kind of gathering is taking place. Not a celebration or social visit, but a survival council. The heads of 7 households sit around his table, faces grave in the firelight, planning how to ensure everyone survives until spring. The widow Ashford's roof collapsed under the snow weight. William begins, his voice heavy with responsibility. Her stores are buried, her hearth is cold. She and her 3 young ones need immediate shelter. Without hesitation, Robert the miller speaks up. "We have room. The mill house is sturdy. Built to carry grain weight, it can handle snow. My wife has already prepared bedding." This isn't charity in the modern sense. It's the activation of an ancient survival protocol, understood by all, questioned by none. The social structures that enabled winter survival were complex and multi-layered, based not on written laws, but on generations of accumulated wisdom about what worked, what failed, what behaviors strengthened the community, and what actions weakened it. These unwritten rules governed everything from resource sharing to dispute resolution, from marriage arrangements to funeral rites. "Young Thomas Cooper has broken his leg," William continues. "He cannot work his craft, cannot maintain his fires. His family will need firewood and food until he heals. Immediately, assignments are made. Each household will contribute according to their ability. The Baker family, prosperous from autumn grain sales, will provide a daily loaf. The woodcutter's sons will deliver firewood every 3rd day. The blacksmith will sharpen tools in trade for future barrel repairs. Everyone gives, everyone receives, the web of obligation growing stronger with each exchange. These weren't simple transactions, but investments in social capital. The help given today would be remembered, recorded not in ledgers, but in the collective memory of the community. When the baker's son fell ill next winter, when the woodcutter needed help clearing storm damage, the debts would be repaid. Not exactly, not immediately, but inevitably. Emma, the baker's wife, understood this deeply. "We give not from our surplus, but from our substance," she would tell her children as they prepared the Cooper family's bread. "Not because we are wealthy, but because we are wise. Today we are strong and they are weak. Tomorrow?" She would shrug expressively. "Tomorrow the wheel turns, and we may be the ones needing help." The mechanisms for maintaining social cohesion during winter's enforced proximity were sophisticated. Medieval people understood that months of close quarters could transform minor irritations into murderous rage, that cabin fever was as dangerous as physical cold. They developed strategies to prevent social breakdown, to channel tensions productively, to maintain harmony when every instinct might scream for solitude. Storytelling served as more than entertainment. It was social regulation. Stories of heroes who shared their last crust, of villains who hoarded while neighbors starved, of communities that survived through cooperation and ones that perished through selfishness. These tales shaped behavior more effectively than any law, creating internal constraints that operated even when no one was watching. The weekly gatherings rotated between homes, sharing the burden of hosting, the consumption of precious firewood and candles. No family bore the full cost of community socializing, but every family contributed. These gatherings weren't optional. Absence without serious cause was noted, discussed, remembered. At tonight's gathering in the weaver's cottage, 20 souls crowd into a space meant for 6. Bodies press close for warmth. Children nestled among adults like puppies in a pile. The air grows thick with breath and smoke, but no one complains. This closeness is survival. Old Margaret begins the evening's first tale, her voice pitched to carry over the wind's howling. In the days of your great-grandfathers, when the Norse raiders still troubled our shores, there lived a man who thought his wealth could replace his neighbor's. The story unfolds predictably, yet powerfully. The rich man builds high walls, stocks deep stores, dismisses his neighbor's offers of mutual aid. When crisis comes, when raiders or wolves or disease threaten, his walls become his prison. His gold cannot fight, his grain cannot stand watch. He perishes alone while the cooperating community survives. Every child absorbs the message, every adult nods recognition. The stories change details, but never themes. Cooperation brings life. Isolation brings death. The community is stronger than any individual. Wisdom lies not in independence, but in interdependence. The practical mechanisms of sharing were highly developed. Food exchanges followed complex protocols that preserved dignity while ensuring survival. A family running low on grain wouldn't beg. Instead, they might arrive at a neighbor's door with a small pot of preserved fruit. We find ourselves with more apple butter than we can use before it spoils. Would you help us by taking some? The neighbor, understanding perfectly, would accept graciously, then mention almost casually, "How fortunate. We were just saying we have more grain than storage. Perhaps you could help us by taking a bag." Face was saved. Needs were met. The social fabric remained intact. These exchanges were calibrated precisely. Too generous, and you might offend by implying the recipient was charity-dependent. Too stingy, and you marked yourself as selfish. The goal was balance. Reciprocity, the maintenance of rough equality that allowed everyone to feel they contributed. Children learned these protocols through observation and practice. Young Mary accompanies her mother on a sharing visit, watches the careful dance of offering and accepting, the precise words chosen, the body language that conveyed respect and gratitude without servility or condescension. "Never make them feel lesser," her mother instructs afterward. "We share not because they are poor and we are rich, but because we are all vulnerable, all dependent on each other. Today we have extra. Tomorrow we may need. The wheel always turns." The resolution of conflicts during winter required special delicacy. Normal tensions became magnified when escape was impossible, when every day brought forced interaction with those you might prefer to avoid. Medieval communities developed sophisticated mediation practices, ways to address grievances without destroying the cooperation essential for survival. When John Thatcher accused Thomas Miller of shorting his grain, a charge that could poison relations for the entire winter, the community responded swiftly. Not with formal trial, but with careful investigation by trusted elders. Evidence was examined, witnesses consulted, but always with an eye toward resolution rather than punishment. Elder Simon, respected for his fairness, rendered judgment. The measure was, indeed, short, but by accident, not design. Thomas will make good the shortage plus a 10th part for the trouble caused. John will accept this without further complaint. Both will share ale at the next gathering to show the matter is resolved. Both men complied, not from love of justice, but from understanding that continued conflict would make them pariahs. would exclude them from the mutual aid networks that meant survival. Social pressure accomplished what law could not. Enforced compliance through the threat of isolation, more effectively than any physical punishment. The care of those unable to care for themselves, the elderly, the disabled, the orphaned, revealed medieval communities at their most sophisticated. These vulnerable individuals weren't hidden away or ignored, but integrated into household economies where their contributions, however small, were valued. Old Agnes, crippled by age and arthritis, could no longer spin thread or tend fires, but she could watch sleeping babies while mothers worked, could tell stories that entertained and educated, could share weather wisdom accumulated over 70 winters. Her presence in the baker's household wasn't charity, but exchange. Her knowledge and small services for food and shelter. The assignment of orphans followed careful deliberation. Which households had space? Which could provide appropriate training? Which needed extra hands? The goal wasn't just survival, but integration, creating new family bonds that would endure beyond immediate need. Young James, orphaned when winter fever took both parents, was placed with Harold the carpenter. Not randomly, but thoughtfully. Harold had no sons, needed an apprentice, had the patient temperament suitable for training a grieving boy. The relationship began as necessity, but grew into genuine affection. James gaining not just shelter, but a trade and a future. The management of communal resources required delicate balance. The village well, the common pasture, the shared oven, the mill, these belonged to everyone and no one. Their use was governed by custom so ancient it had the force of law, but flexible enough to accommodate changing circumstances. When the communal well showed signs of failing during a particularly harsh freeze, when ice formed deeper than ever before recorded, the response was immediate and coordinated. Every able-bodied person contributed labor. The elderly provided advice based on previous crises. Children carried tools and messages. Resources flowed from private to public, without question. The well serves all, so all serve the well, William the Reeve declared, and work began despite the brutal cold. Shifts were organized to prevent frostbite. Warm food appeared regularly, provided by various households without formal assignment. Tools were shared, expertise was pooled. The well was saved through efforts no single family could have managed. The preservation of social harmony required constant attention. Successful communities developed early warning systems for brewing conflicts. Gossip, often dismissed as idle chatter, served as intelligence gathering, identifying tensions before they exploded, allowing intervention while positions remained flexible. When whispers suggested growing resentment between the Tanner and Smith families over a proposed marriage alliance, elder women took action. Informal visits were made, opinions were solicited, compromises were suggested. All without formal acknowledgement that mediation was occurring. By the time the families met officially, ground had been prepared, positions had softened, agreement was possible. Music and dance served crucial social functions during the long winter months. The weekly gatherings always included communal singing, not for mere entertainment, but for synchronization, for creating shared rhythm and purpose. Voices joining in harmony created physical and psychological bonds, reminded individuals they were part of something larger. The dances were carefully structured, ensuring everyone participated, preventing the formation of exclusive cliques. Partners rotated, positions changed, no one remained isolated. Even the clumsiest dancers were included, their efforts praised, their participation valued above their skill. Young Robert, shy and awkward, dreaded the dancing until Margaret the Wise took him aside. "Your steps matter less than your presence," she told him gently. "When you join the dance, you tell everyone you're part of us, that you trust us, that you'll stand with us. That's worth more than all the fancy footwork in the world." The sharing of news and information followed established patterns. Travelers reaching the village were brought first to the Reeve, who evaluated their trustworthiness and the import of their news. Information was then disseminated through careful channels, ensuring accuracy while preventing panic. When a traveling merchant brought word of disease in nearby villages, of a sweating sickness that killed within days, William didn't announce it publicly. Instead, he consulted with key households, prepared response plans, ensured medicine supplies were adequate. Only then was news shared broadly, along with practical steps for prevention. Panic was avoided while preparation proceeded. The economic structures of medieval communities during winter were remarkably sophisticated. Understanding that currency was scarce and barter cumbersome, they developed complex systems of delayed reciprocity, of social debt and credit that could span years. The blacksmith might shoe the baker's horse in January, accepting payment not in bread, but in promise. Come harvest, when the baker had grain, but the blacksmith needed flour, the debt would be remembered, adjusted for circumstances, settled fairly. These invisible ledgers, maintained in collective memory, created economic resilience no amount of coined money could match. Even entertainment served survival functions. The riddle contests weren't just intellectual exercise, but training in flexible thinking. The memory games preserved crucial information in forms that could survive illiteracy. The competitive storytelling pushed creators to embed more useful knowledge in their tales. What grows shorter as it grows older? Young Tom posed to the gathering. A candle, several voices called out, but Tom shook his head. Winter daylight, he announced triumphantly. The riddle sparked discussion of daylight patterns, of how to recognize winter's turning point, of hope embedded in careful observation. The treatment of rule breakers revealed the sophistication of social control. Punishment was calibrated not for retribution, but for reintegration. The goal was not to destroy, but to correct, to bring wanderers back into the fold, to maintain community cohesion above all. When young William was caught stealing preserved meat from a neighbor's store, the response was swift but measured. Public humiliation, yes. He stood before the gathered community and confessed his crime. Restitution, certainly. He worked extra hours to replace what was taken, but also rehabilitation. Elder men took him hunting, teaching him honorable ways to provide. Women ensured his family had enough to prevent future temptation. We cannot afford to lose anyone, Elder Simon explained to those who wanted harsher punishment. Every pair of hands is needed, every back required for the work ahead. We correct to preserve, not to destroy. Tomorrow his strength might save your children. The role of women in maintaining social cohesion deserves special recognition. While men often held official positions, women wove the informal networks that truly held communities together. They arranged marriages that strengthened alliances, mediated disputes before they reached public attention, coordinated aid so subtly recipients barely noticed. Martha the baker's wife maintained mental maps of every household's needs and resources, knew which families had surplus and which faced shortage, orchestrated exchanges that seemed spontaneous but were carefully planned. Her morning visits to draw water became intelligence-gathering missions. Her afternoon bakings produced exactly enough extra loaves for struggling households. "Men think they run the village," she would tell her daughter with a knowing smile. "Let them think so. We women know better. We know that power lies not in commanding, but in connecting, in weaving webs so strong that all are supported, all are lifted. Let the men make pronouncements. We'll make sure people survive." The integration of spiritual and practical life strengthened social bonds. Religious observances weren't separate from survival activities, but intertwined with them. Prayers blessed shared meals. Holy days structured work patterns. Sacred stories reinforced social values. The winter feast of St. Thomas, December 21st, marked more than religious observance. It signaled the official beginning of deep winter preparations, the last chance for major repairs, the final opportunity for families to relocate if their situations were untenable. The saint's story of doubt transformed to faith, paralleled communities' journey from autumn uncertainty to winter solidarity. Father Benedict understood his role extended beyond spiritual guidance. His sermons reinforced communal values. His confessional became a release valve for tensions that might otherwise explode. His blessings sanctified the social contracts that bound the community together. "We are the body of Christ," he would intone, but his gestures encompassed not just the church, but the entire village. When one suffers, all suffer. When one rejoices, all rejoice. This is not mere scripture, but survival truth. We live together, or we perish separately. Children absorbed these lessons through constant exposure, through games that rewarded cooperation over competition, through stories that glorified mutual aid, through daily examples of adults sacrificing individual comfort for communal good. By the time they reached adulthood, communal thinking was as natural as breathing. The transition from autumn individualism to winter communalism happened gradually, but inevitably. As temperatures dropped and daylight shortened, as the margin for error narrowed, behaviors shifted. Private stores became communal resources. Family concerns expanded to village worries. Individual survival merged into collective persistence. This wasn't socialism or communism in any modern sense. Private property remained, individual initiative was valued, but overlaying these was an understanding that in winter, the community became a superorganism, its survival superseding any individual claim. This flexibility, this ability to shift between individual and collective modes, was perhaps medieval society's greatest innovation. As winter reached its deepest point, when food stores ran low and spirits flagged, when it seemed spring would never come, the social fabric was tested most severely. This was when the strength of communal bonds revealed itself, when the investments in social capital paid their dividends. Families that had shared generously found their pantries mysteriously replenished. Individuals who had helped others discovered willing hands when crisis struck. The complex web of obligation and reciprocity, invisible in good times, became a safety net that caught those who might otherwise have fallen. And when spring finally came, when doors opened and people emerged into warming air, the community had been transformed. Not just survived, but strengthened. Bonds forged in necessity had become preferences. Relationships born of survival had deepened into genuine affection. The village that entered winter as a collection of households emerged as a unified whole. The memory of shared trials, of mutual aid freely given and gratefully received, of individual sacrifices for communal good. These became the stories told for generations. The lessons learned, that humans are stronger together than alone. That survival depends more on cooperation than competition. That community is not a luxury, but a necessity. These truths were carved into the collective consciousness as deeply as any physical mark. In our modern world of assumed independence, of imagined self-sufficiency, of atomized existence, we might learn from these medieval communities, not to romanticize their hardships, not to minimize their struggles, but to understand their profound insight that human survival has always been a collective endeavor, that the bonds between us are not constraints, but lifelines, that in the darkest winters of whatever form, we save each other or we are not saved at all.